Good afternoon, and welcome to Vanderbilt Divinity School and the 2021 Mayfoy Carlisle Bogitsh Memorial Lecture. This lecture was established by a gift from Professor Emeritus Burton Bogitsh and his family in honor of Mrs. Bogitsh, who grew up as a Baptist in a small farming community in West Texas, where her mother, Una Hooper Carlisle, taught her the principle of religious tolerance. Mayfoy studied comparative religion at Baylor University and cultivated a profound interest in various world religions and cultures from which they arose. This interest grew when she married Burton, a man of Jewish heritage, and both involved themselves with the Unitarian tradition. The Mayfoy Carlisle Bogitsh Memorial Lecture honors her lifelong interest in the interplay between culture and religious expression. The Divinity School uses this lectureship to feature the work of both the Divinity School and the wider university faculty in a more intimate conversation to explore each other's work. This year's lecturer is Professor Joerg Rieger, who is the Distinguished Professor of Theology, the Cal Turner Chancellor's Chair of Wesleyan Studies, the founding director of the Winnicott Program in Religion and Justice, and affiliate faculty with the Turner Center Family Center for Social Ventures that is housed in the university's Owen School, Graduate School of Management. Rieger's work brings together the study of theology and of the movements for liberation and justice that mark our age. His constructive work in theology draws on a wide range of historical and contemporary traditions, with a concern for the roles that images of the divine play in the pressures of everyday life, locally, nationally, and internationally. Author and editor of more than 24 books and more than 165 academic articles, his books have been translated into Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, German, Korean, and Chinese. Rieger has lectured throughout the United States as well as internationally. This afternoon, he returns home. The title of his Bogitsh lecture is Beyond Dialogue, Revisiting Interreligious Engagement, Truth, and Power. I encourage you to post questions in the Q&A that you will see at the bottom of your screen. And I promise we will get to as many as possible in the time we have together tonight. Welcome, Professor Rieger.
Thank you so much, Dean Towns. Thank you for this welcome, and it is good to be home here at Vanderbilt University. I want to thank you as well as all the colleagues and the students at Vanderbilt Divinity School and Vanderbilt University. and especially the family of Malfoy Carlyle Bogitsh. It is an honor to be delivering this lecture, and I look forward to spending this time with you. Two notes before I get going. First of all, in this presentation, I'll be talking about dominant notions of truth and power as they shape up in dominant religious traditions. My main example will be Christianity, not because I lack interest in other religions. In fact, I'm very interested in all three Abrahamic traditions as well as in engaged Buddhism. But I do so because Christianity is my own tradition and it stands in need of critical reflection. My basic point in this presentation is that interreligious engagement is no longer optional, but that typical attempts to engage other religions often fail if they do not deal adequately with questions of power. Let me share my screen here and then we can begin with the lecture. Let's see if this is working. I believe this is working, right? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In the Gospel of John, Jesus famously claims to be the way, the truth, and the life. Many religious communities use this claim to put down other religious traditions. In their minds, if Jesus is right, all others must be wrong, which makes, of course, engagement of different religious positions pointless. On the other extreme are those who assume that despite different religious convictions, all religions are ultimately the same. Here, interreligious dialogue is based on the assumption that religions are more alike than different. But what about cases where religious traditions are not compatible? To be sure, compatibility is not only a problem in encounters among different religions. There are cases when compatibility should not even be presumed within the same religion. Let me use Christianity as an example. In Nazi Germany, some Christians were convinced that their faith demanded support of Adolf Hitler, while others were convinced that their faith demanded resistance to Hitler. This raises serious questions about compatibility. In fact, I would argue that the difference between these two camps is more significant than differences between Christianity and other religions. In this case, a Christianity whose faith demanded resistance to Hitler may have had more in common with a Buddhism or a Judaism that also resisted Hitler than with a Christianity who supported the Nazi regime. Today, it seems to me, we face a similar problem in the United States. The difference between Christians who support white supremacy and Christians who resist it may well be greater than the difference between Christians and Jews or Buddhists who agree on their resistance to white supremacy. These observations call for new approaches to interreligious dialogue. In this presentation, I will suggest some of the basic themes, and I will be making several points. My first one has to do with the claim of truth. Dominant images of truth are often unilateral. Throughout the history of Christianity, Jesus' claim to be the truth has often been appropriated by empires as an endorsement of various forms of unilateral top-down power. Empires claiming unilateral truth rarely engage in dialogue and conversation, and when they do, they maintain control and supply the answers. In the history of Christianity, this starts with the Roman Empire, and it continues all the way into the present. In contrast to such unilateral truth claims, Jesus' claim to truth appears to have a distinctly different flavor. According to the texts of the Gospels, Jesus initiates conversations that uncover truth in unlikely places. In his parables, he finds truth in the actions of ordinary people, men and women, shepherds, fisherfolk, and working people, and people struggling with debt. Their truth frequently contradicts dominant takes on reality. In one story, Jesus reluctantly heals the daughter of a Syrophoenician woman. What is remarkable here, though, is that this woman embodies a truth that makes Jesus change his mind. In some cases, outsiders understood Jesus' truth better than insiders, including his own disciples. Examples include Samaritans, like the so-called woman at the well in the Gospel of John. This kind of truth is related to what might be called the truth of the multitude. This truth is grounded in collective wisdom that includes many of the Jewish traditions on which Jesus relied. Such traditions continue to challenge us to this day in people's movements and their traditions. My colleague Kwok Pui Lan and I have developed this notion of the multitude in our book Occupy Religion that you see on the slide, where we're drawing on the traditions of Korean Minjung theology, engaging biblical notions of the multitude, and on the work of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. There are other places where Jesus challenges unilateral notions of truth, and they include his response to disciples' repeated quarrels about being the greatest. Jesus does so by moving truth from the top to the bottom. In general, truth is reframed here. Samaritans and tax collectors, in solidarity with the least of these, are aligned with truth. And religious and political officials who do not support the least of these are not. In the pursuit of this kind of truth, new possibilities for interreligious dialogue emerge. Christianity, as it developed during the early centuries, may serve as the example because it still embodies something of this truth of the multitude. There's a common mistake that assumes that Christianity was one uniform religion in its beginning, and that diversity of perspectives developed only later on. You'll see my little doodle on the PowerPoint on the left. Christianity starting narrow and then it's broadening. That's a mistaken assumption. And scholars in New Testament studies have disputed this commonly held assumption, showing that no single uniform formulation of Christian faith existed until the 4th century, which, as you may know, was the time when the Emperor Constantine convened and presided over the Council of Nicaea, thus establishing some unilateral truth of the empire. My doodle on the right gives you a better idea of what might have happened. Initially, Christianity was diverse, even more diverse than the diversity of the books that made it eventually into the New Testament canon. As the German scholar Ernst Käsemann demonstrated, even the New Testament canon does not establish the unity of the early church, but rather its plurality. The history of Christianity affirms that religions are rarely homogeneous. Only when Christianity became the established religion of the Roman Empire under the Emperor Constantine did it become more streamlined. So this is sort of the middle of that hourglass. What changed the understanding of truth operative in Christianity was Roman imperialism. While up to that point, diversity and truth were commonly seen as compatible. In contrast to the diversity of truth manifested in the life of Jesus and in early Christianity, the truth of dominant religion is clean, unilateral, and universal, and of course deployed by the powerful to shore up their power. The dominant truth of the Roman Empire is only one example. Subsequent empires developed their own forms of unilateral and universal truth. I'm thinking of the Spanish conquest, European colonialisms, and all sorts of fascisms, including contemporary mindsets of domination embodied by dominant races, genders, nations, and elite economic classes. By contrast, the truth of subaltern religions such as the Jesus movement and early Christianity, as well as many other non-Christian subaltern religious traditions, resists domination and is embodied by the many rather than by the few. Even in the Gospel of John and other Johannine writings, where the notion of truth is more prominent than in the Synoptic Gospels and where Jesus claims to be the way, the truth, and the life, there is a sense of complexity of non-dominant truth. Truth is not a well-defined philosophical idea, but something that happens on the way. Truth is done in the Gospel of John. This is a notion of truth that may well be closer to the popular Jewish cultures of the time than to the philosophical ideas of Roman and Hellenistic elites. In sum, truth that unilaterally moves from the top down is problematic because it either usurps or excludes the majority of humanity and their varied religious traditions. Note that both the forced inclusion and the forced exclusion of others can be part of the logic of empire. Such unilateral truth benefits the few rather than the many, like the Roman emperors of the past or the top 1% today, and all those who have an interest to shape the rest of the world in their own image. It is not hard to see that interreligious encounters are in trouble when this kind of truth is the norm. More than just interreligious communication is endangered, however. At stake are also the subaltern markers of religious traditions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and many others. I will come back to this at the end. My second point has to do with the drawing of lines. The Gospel of John, the only place in the Bible where Jesus claims to be the way, the truth, and the life, has often been characterized as dualistic in character. On your screen, you'll see the well-known Johannine dualisms of light and darkness, love and hate, good and evil, truth and lies. At first glance, such an attitude may not sit well with efforts to establish interreligious engagement. It also does not sit well, of course, with current fashions of the postmodern academy. Dialogue, however, requires not only openness, but also an acknowledgement of limits. Torturers and their victims, to use an extreme example that may deserve a trigger warning. Torturers and their victims cannot enter into dialogue. More specifically, victims of torture must refuse dialogue in order to defeat the goals of their torturers. Similar dynamics occur when other incompatible positions clash and where one side benefits from a marked power differential. Today, anti-white supremacist Christians need to develop clear understandings of the boundaries and limits that separate them from white supremacist Christianity. In fact, well-meaning efforts at dialogue can end catastrophically when the power differentials are too great and when lives are at stake. When considering limits of interreligious dialogue, the boundaries are not always where one might expect them to be, as the lines that need to be drawn are not necessarily between different religions. Instead, lines may need to be drawn within religious traditions themselves. The conflict in the Gospel of John may offer one such example. John's challenges are presented to people who belong to the same religion, but who have made common cause with the dominant status quo. Some at least, not all. Unfortunately and misleadingly, the Gospel of John calls these power brokers the Jews. Yet this Johannine term, unfortunate, the Jews, does not refer to all people who are Jewish. It refers instead to certain leaders of the community who find themselves in positions of power and dominance. At stake in the Gospel of John is therefore not a conflict between Christianity and Judaism, but one between competing forms of the same religion, between dominant and subaltern religious traditions, as it were. This observation is relevant for the topic of my lecture because it is precisely this resistance to religious dominance, this drawing of a line within a particular religion, that establishes a different kind of interreligious encounter. The perhaps outdated dualism of the Gospel of John, though, gains an unexpected relevance here, because it is instructive for how interreligious dialogues could be reframed. The tension between truth and untruth is not between absolute claims of truth, but between embodied ways of life and resistance to contexts of domination. For John, truth is always embodied. It is either done or not done. And the test of truth is whether it liberates. This is this famous passage from John 8:32, the truth will make you free. Nevertheless, the line within one's own religious tradition does not have to be drawn narrowly. As mentioned earlier, Christian uniformity did not appear to be necessary early on. Jewish Christians coexisted with Gentile Christians, and even within each of these groups, disagreements were the norm, and nobody seemed to be too worried about it. What held them together was not a narrowly regulated set of ideas, but the difference between the ways of Jesus and the ways of the Roman Empire. One moving towards liberation, the other one moving towards exploitation, exclusion, oppression, and possibly even obliteration. So what lessons for interreligious relationships might be drawn from the challenges that emerge within religious tradition? The Christian history of mission illustrates what is at stake, beginning with not how to engage others, right? Here we can learn some negative lessons, unfortunately, but we have to deal with them. And the reason to do that is because we want to move to a more constructive approach in dealing with other religions and other religions dealing with each other and with Christianity. It's well known that many past examples of mission show the problems with embracing the unilateral truth of empire, failing to draw the line within Christianity and drawing the lines in all the wrong places. Converting people during the Spanish conquest of America, aided by fire and the sword, is an example of drawing the lines in all the wrong places. But even many of the less violent missions of more recent centuries have drawn lines in the wrong places. Both the 16th century Spanish theologian Bartolomé de las Casas and the 19th century Prussian theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher assumed that mission by force was wrong-headed and that the way of Jesus was marked by attraction rather than by coercion. That's certainly progress, but perhaps not enough, because neither of them, despite developing a certain respect for other religions, harbored any doubt that their own religion was superior. Both Las Casas and Schleiermacher embraced vestiges of imperial truth, even if truth was now embodied by soft rather than by hard power. The missions to indigenous people in the United States illustrate where lines do need to be drawn. The surprising twist of this history is that many missionaries who promoted dominant religious interests did not benefit much personally. My Osage colleague, George Tinker, has investigated the story of Christian missionaries to indigenous people. And he figured out that they did not gain much wealth and power themselves, even though they helped others gain wealth and power, often without even being aware of it. The problem here was a failure to draw lines between dominant and subaltern forms of religion, Christianity included. And so the missionaries embraced unilateral ideas of truth that prevented them from engaging the truth of indigenous populations. For this reason, even some of their more laudable efforts backfired. Mission schools, for instance, that sought to support indigenous families and their children ended up being places of re-education in the dominant truth and ultimately of obliteration and destruction. Before moving on, here's one more concern I still need to address related to liberal efforts to avoid drawing lines altogether. While these efforts open some doors, they create problems because they refuse to engage the lines that run within religions themselves. As a result, liberals often miss the difference between dominant and subaltern perspectives in their own religions. The consequence of such refusals to draw lines, and ultimately this is affecting not only liberals but also conservatives, the consequence is that dominant religious perspectives usually win out. Moreover, liberal refusals to draw lines by declaring all religions basically the same also miss learning from unique contributions of other religions. And so the trouble here is that we cannot really learn from each other. So here I want to make a different suggestion forward for embracing interreligious encounters and dialogue. My third point is about taking sides. It may come as a surprise, but there is some wisdom in Jesus's prayer that can help deepen interreligious engagements. The final passage of this prayer reads, "And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one," or from evil. Those who have to be worried about trials are either the ones who have gotten in trouble with the law, or they are the underdogs, the ones who are subjected to trials and indicted even though they have done nothing wrong. In the United States, this latter concern is well documented in the experience of racial and ethnic minorities. Similar experiences are shared by many who practice non-Christian religions in the United States, especially if they display markers of non-Christian religious identity, like Muslim women, for instance, who wear headscarves or burqas. Interreligious engagement today needs to take into account these experiences. In other words, and this may well be the main point of my presentation this evening, without a closer investigation of how power flows, there can be no meaningful interreligious encounter. In the context of prejudice, harassment, and mistreatment, which obviously marks our age, interreligious dialogue needs to be developed based on new kinds of relationships. Fairness, not judging some harsher than others and not falsely accusing them, is a good start. However, I'm arguing that the demands of justice go deeper. In the ancient Jewish traditions from which Jesus draws, justice means not merely maintaining neutrality, but taking the side of those who have been harmed and re-establishing relationships. This marks the fundamental difference between the Roman goddess Justitia's supposed neutrality and Jesus' commitment to justice inspired by Jewish traditions. Of course, this is our whole modern legal system. And in many cases, of course, we would be happy if at least we would have neutrality, which we oftentimes don't. What I'm arguing for, though, is what would happen if we understood justice as taking the side of the victims. I'm getting my inspiration here from the Jewish notions of justice that emerge from some of the Hebrew traditions, which are also picked up by Jesus and early Christianity, and you will find some of those in Islam as well. Here, I think we can draw some inspiration for interreligious encounters. Those religions which are less dominant and being repressed in a given context deserve not only a fair deal, but special consideration and solidarity. So we're not just talking about neutrality being open-minded, but to give special religions to those, special consideration to those religious traditions that are repressed and are experiencing violence and pushback at the moment. Of course, we are all agreed, I believe, that neutrality and fairness are preferable to bias and unfairness, but this is not sufficient here. Siding with subaltern strains of religion changes the dynamics of interreligious encounters because it initiates a relationship that forces dominant strains of religion to take a deep look at themselves and to determine where change is necessary. For example, while many Christians in the United States tend to suspect Muslims of being violent, actual encounters with Muslims throw light on a 1,000-year-old history of Christian violence against Muslims, beginning with the Crusades of the Middle Ages. For Christians, this means not only that the term crusade is no longer acceptable, but that relationships that embody modern notions of crusading are no longer viable in any way. Rethinking Christian-Muslim relationships in this way would make a tremendous difference. What about the second half of Jesus' petition, the rescue from evil? Under the conditions of the Roman Empire, the roots of evil may have been more obvious than they are today. Peasants back then would have known that their suffering was caused by relationships of exploitation as they experienced their masters more directly, oftentimes the whip directly on their own bodies. Today, the roots of evil can be more difficult to see as relationships of exploitation are often less visible and direct. This is one reason why people often blame the wrong parties, like immigrants and minorities, for instance. Blaming the wrong parties is also, of course, commonplace when other religions are blamed. Islam is often falsely accused for violence, Hinduism for social hierarchies in the caste system, Buddhism for shoring up capitalism, Judaism for financial issues, and most non-Christian religions too often are accused of lacking respect for women. A clearer sense of the roots of evil would ease the way of misguided blame that is putting significant weight on interreligious relationships. The same is true, by the way, for interracial and intergender relationships as well. Let me be clear. Violence, social hierarchies, financial woes, and lack of respect for women are not necessarily the trademark of any religion. They are rather deeply embedded in the unjust structures that our neocolonial societies have created, often with the help of distorted forms of religion. Most significant among these is a distorted Christianity that has risen to power in conjunction with the hegemony of neoliberal capitalism. Kevin Kruse's book, One Nation Under God, that you see on the slide, tells part of that story. Religious and cultural violence is therefore deeply rooted in political and economic structures that play people off against each other, often using religion as simply a pretext. And even the much discussed clash of civilizations is based on conflicts that have deeper roots than many care to admit. A clearer sense of the roots of evil can also help people to stop blaming themselves, a common condition in situations of grave power differentials. Peasants in Jesus' time needed to stop blaming themselves. They were not poor because they were lazy or inferior human beings. The same realization applies to essential workers today who often have no choice but to work minimum wage jobs. Talking about the roots of evil can help people to stop blaming themselves. While religious traditions, Christianity included, have often been used for the purposes of evil, we hope, of course, we tend to believe that they can also be used for good. This is the point of praying for rescue from evil. The clash here is not between civilizations, and neither is it a clash between religions as such. The clash is between the few who benefit from the flow of dominant power and the others who do not. The clash runs right through civilizations and religious traditions, and this is what ultimately requires the taking of sides. This clash does not have to have the last word, though. It can be tackled when religions work together for the good against evil, and when they join together in searching for the way, the truth, and the life of the multitude against untruth and death. In recent history, this kind of interreligious encounter can be seen in prominent struggles against exploitation that led people of various faiths to pool their energies in the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, and budding relations of religion and labor. In other words, I'm suggesting that working together against evil and taking sides for the common good needs to be the location of interreligious engagement. Let me repeat that. That's my main point here. Working together against evil, taking sides for the common good needs to be the location of interreligious engagement and perhaps dialogue. In this context, the various religions can investigate how their own traditions function both for good and for ill, and thereby ultimately learn from each other. This approach liberates practitioners of religion from the need to claim either that all religions are just the same or that theirs perhaps is even a superior form of faith. I'm moving on to my final point, and I'm looking forward to a conversation afterwards. So you may have some questions that you can put in the chat, and that will then be discussed at the right time. My final point here is beyond dialogue. So drawing some conclusions for interreligious encounters by returning one more time, pardon me for that, to the Jesus traditions. On the one hand, Jesus promotes inclusion and broadens the circle of recipients of the good news. The sick, the oppressed, the poor, all of them are included. In some cases, the circle is broadened even further when non-Jewish people enter Jesus's conversations on their own terms and make him change his mind. Those moments are significant. This means, of course, that the Johannine Jesus' claim to being the way, the truth, and the life does not have to be understood in an exclusivist sense in terms of the unilateral truth of the empire. On the other hand, though, Jesus does exclude, and he draws a line when it comes to those who use religion for self-serving purposes and to impose burdens on others. The limits to inclusion have to do with the misuse of religion and support of the power and domination of the few that produces misery and suffering for the many. The line that is drawn here and that needs to be drawn, this is most important, is not between different religions, but within religious traditions. In other words, this line in no way precludes interreligious encounters and dialogue, just the opposite. Drawing this line is what makes fruitful interreligious encounters possible in the first place. It may seem paradoxical that the horizons are broadened precisely when a line is drawn and when a stand is taken. Yet this is the lesson for interreligious dialogue presented by subaltern religious traditions like the Jesus movement, the Johannine community, and early Christianity. The same could be argued, of course, also for other subaltern religious traditions today. This is a long list, but let me begin naming some of them. I'm thinking about Dalit Hinduism in India, thinking about engaged Buddhism around the world, Judaism, which challenges imperial forms of Zionism. And I'm also thinking about Islam in various struggles, for instance, standing together against apartheid in South Africa. In all of these examples, interreligious encounters were common and still are and are flourishing. Different kinds of interreligious encounters begin, therefore, when different religious communities join in the struggle against the imperial spirit of domination and unilateral truth. This is my basic proposal in the lecture tonight, thinking about what drawing lines might ultimately mean for broadening our horizons. Struggling against the imperial spirit of domination and unilateral truth, I'm arguing is what ultimately helps us broaden not only our horizons, but fight oppression, fight injustice, and stand together, recognizing, celebrating, appreciating our differences. Stand together against that which threatens life on planet Earth today as we know it. So there are big challenges, but on the other hand, I'm hopeful and not just dreaming here that there are also big solutions, and some of them are already on the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joerg. That, that gives us a lot to think about. Thank you so much. I see that we do have some questions in Q&A, so I will turn to them. Myra Moreland has asked or said, go back to John and Jesus saying, I am the truth and the way and the life. Does the idea of the way go beyond Jesus the man and truly open up dialogue beyond Christianity? Is Jesus intentionally blurring the lines of exclusion?
So I'm not claiming to be an expert on the Gospel of John, but it seems to me there are some struggles that are worth considering and what some people these days would rather not talk about, namely a dualism that thinks about questions like what are we up against? What I'm saying is that this is something that's necessary if we really want to see not only what threatens us, but what unites us. So if you realize there's something that actually threatens the existence of people, these are life and death struggles in many cases. We can then build solidarity in ways that do not demand uniformity, that do not demand identity, but that simply bring people together in fighting against what it is that challenges their existence. This is the sort of dynamic I believe you could find in the Johannine communities. That's not to argue, therefore, though, that they're free of any and all of the problems that we're facing, including perhaps, sexism or other sorts of prejudice. I'm just arguing that it is necessary for us today to think about these challenges in more concise fashion. And here, simply staying within the religious realm is not enough. So my argument was, when we think about that which threatens us, we need to think more broadly. We need to think about political forces, economic forces. Back in John's case, of course, there was a specific empire at work. In our own time, we're talking about empire again. Some of my work is talking about religion and empire. And once we figure that out, I think we can then deepen our religious conversation. So it's not a matter of leaving one field and entering another. It's more a matter of thinking about how everything is connected. And my basic argument is, once we realize that which threatens us, we then can do our religious work, our proper religious work, and our interreligious work in new ways, not only more responsibly, but also more effectively, so that it makes a difference.
You're muted.
I appreciated your focus on violence as a salient theme in religion and how important taking sides is in light of that. I am curious, given the theological diversity present in the US, how we might organize and mobilize a mass movement to counteract this trend. Vanderbilt Divinity School's own theological diversity might be an important reference, as theological schools play no insignificant role in such organizing efforts. Where might theological diversity be weakest in our contributions to mass movements, particularly in a culture which promotes self-serving action as a God-given right, both among conservatives and liberals?
Well, there's a lot going on in this question. I wish we had some more time and maybe could even talk face to face. If the person wants to follow up with me later, feel free to check in with me at my Vanderbilt Divinity email. But let me make a couple of comments here. The first thing really is that diversity is nothing to be afraid of. So diversity here is not the problem. The problem that we're facing is exploitation, oppression, exclusion, obliteration. You can use various terms here. All of these apply in certain ways. There's great danger that we're facing not only to humanity, as you know, but also to the planet. What I'm saying is if we realize that these might be things that would move us closer together, not in terms of sameness or identity, but really in terms of figuring out what our various religious traditions have to contribute in order to fight that which we're up against. That's where I find the excitement personally in interreligious dialogue. It took me a while to find that out, but once I saw it, I was fully there. In other words, if you're fighting some of the big problems of our age, say white supremacy being one, where religion is always a part of it also, you will realize that you may have some resources from your own religious traditions, but other religious traditions have other resources. And the more of these resources we can bring to bear, the stronger the movement will be. That doesn't have to mean that we're therefore always understanding each other or agreeing with each other, but this is how we can learn from each other. This is how I can understand better what I can bring to the table. And I also need to understand what I need to bring to the table. I need to understand what's the problem in my own religious traditions. This is why I talked about Christianity so much today, because I think in order to move forward to a true position that works through diversity, you have to be self-critical first. You have to understand what is wrong, how power flows the wrong way, and where you have to say no. And oftentimes, this was my example from German fascism, you have to say no to people that you think are perhaps closest to you. So the beauty of the Vanderbilt's divinity community is that we have all this diversity that helps us to understand more clearly who we are and also what our contributions might be to the whole. So this is something like unity in difference, perhaps. And no need to march in lockstep, no need to all look alike. But on the other hand, you need to realize that you have something that can make a contribution. I'll give you one personal example here. I happen to be a United Methodist, and I've taught for most of my career in Methodist-related schools. Coming to Vanderbilt was a liberation, not because I could now get away from it, but I could have a clearer understanding what's valuable, what's useful, and maybe also what's problematic in my own tradition, and bring that into the conversation, where ultimately organizing means precisely to build a large movement that can stand up to that which is oppressive. So bringing together minority politics into what might ultimately be considered a majority politics that goes all the way to the 99% of which the Occupy Wall Street movement was talking about. There's a lot more I could talk about for this question, but thank you so much for that question.
Thank you. Next, seems to me we cannot accomplish this as individuals. Seems we need an interfaith workers union, in square quotes, of those wishing to create an alternative to empire. Is Vanderbilt able to assist with the organization of such a union? As long as we stay in the small group silos, empire will retain the power, but united, we would be a significant power.
This is a fascinating question because it brings this notion of union, right? And if you think about union, of course, in the history of our own country, you have to think about labor unions. What's oftentimes not realized is that labor unions are a lot more diverse than many people give them credit for. And it was people like Dr. Martin Luther King and also W.E.B. Du Bois, who at various points in their careers said that perhaps it was the labor unions that made of any organization in this country the biggest progress towards the resistance of racism. So here, unions, of course, that may not be intended in the question, perhaps it is, could be addressed in terms of real established, real relationships that have people working together, realizing that they have more in common than meets the eye. Unions, of course, are also places that are related to the workplace. And I have often argued that these are the greatest places of diversity. If you're looking for racial diversity, gender diversity, sexual diversity, religious diversity, look at the workplaces. Don't look at religious communities or churches or even universities for that matter. If the question is if Vanderbilt can be doing this work, I'm not quite sure how to respond to it because Vanderbilt ultimately is a university and universities have different kinds of missions than unions. There may be ways within the school, within the various schools in plural, to do this work where people work together, where people figure out that they have common interests, including common research interests. One place to do that at Vanderbilt, I think, are the various, Vanderbilt Divinity specifically, are our various programs. The Carpenter program, the Kelly Moore Smith Institute, and also the Wendling Cook program in Religion and Justice that I'm directing. These are some of the efforts that are going on. And if you're curious about that, I'd request that you take a look at what we're doing because we have some very specific projects where we're working on this these days. Maybe one thing I mentioned briefly in the lecture in conclusion to this question, there's a newly emerging religion and labor movement in this country that is decidedly interreligious. So this is a place that's not just driven by one or the other religion. And here I find this unity and diversity that I'm oftentimes missing in other places, where people are coming together for the common good, certainly not as individuals just working for themselves, but ultimately working for the communities. If you think about the history, this is what once upon a time brought us the 8-hour workday, weekends off work, benefits, protections for women at work, the end of child labor. This comes out of collective action between working people and religions about plus minus 100 years ago in our own country. We're oftentimes not aware of this anymore, but I see great potential for these kinds of ways of moving forward together.
Next question. If there's no ultimate truth, then there will never be a true, genuine freedom.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The question is what you mean by ultimate truth. I was talking about unilateral truth that is promoted from the top down. And I think this is the sort of thing we have to be wondering about, because who is it ultimately that tells us what this truth is? What I was arguing for is not to give up truth, but to find it again in community relationships, to find it again in engaged ways of life, to figure out where truth actually liberates us. So if truth and freedom are connected, I'm arguing you actually have to look at where truth is actually liberating you. And this is a question that's not always asked. If you simply ask the philosophical question, do we need truth in order to be free? You could give all kinds of answers. But if you ask the actual question, where is truth setting us free? I think if you look at the history of the United States, you could give some very amazing answers, right? Talk about abolitionism, for instance, which could have, of course, been proclaimed as a truth from the top down, but it had to be fought for as truth from the people. So this was abolitionists and the slaves themselves working together to fight an institution that ultimately had to fall. In the way we write history, we oftentimes think it was a great individual, perhaps an Abraham Lincoln, that liberated the slaves. And Lincoln did important work. I do not want to not admit that. But ultimately, that truth emerged from the bottom in a great struggle, not by somebody preaching it from the top down. You could say the same thing about the civil rights movement, where I saw a number recently when Dr. King was still alive. I think his approval numbers were certainly way below 50%, maybe 28% or something like that. That has changed now. But the dominant truth that was assumed to be the truth of Christian white America at the time did not allow for people to see it. Now, King could not have thought this himself either. Sometimes people think King somehow invented the civil rights movement, but King came into a movement that was already going on, that had a long history, and that was built by people working together, not unilaterally, but bringing to the table the various things that they could carry and that energized them. So this Johannine idea of truth is ultimately what sets you free, puts you on the path towards a research project. You really have to ask the question, which truth is setting you free and which truth isn't. All the conversation about fake news and not fake news and all of that doesn't really matter unless you analyze where freedom is actually accomplished. And as far as I know, freedom has always to be fought for from the bottom up. It's never given from some Mount Olympus from the top down.
Thank you. You suggest exposing the unilateral limits, imperial rendering of truth is a task of interreligious encounters. What do you suggest to broaden the horizons of truth to counter the roots of evil?
So first, I think it's really important to have this conversation about what is evil and what is good, because too oftentimes we assume we know that already, and then that oftentimes ends in propositions that are too shallow. I gave you some examples there. This conversation, say, about the clash of civilizations or the clash of religions as the ultimate problem that we're up against. If you go deeper, I think the problem in our own time, it's not hard to see, is a form of exploitation that extends not only to people, but really to the planet. This is why we have an ecological crisis, not because people are people, but because there are some that benefit at the expense of many others. You see this certainly at in environmental questions, but you can also see it by looking around yourself here in the United States and to figure out what it is that ultimately is valuable, who wins and who loses in that. In the search for truth, I think this is one of the conversations that we need to have. You know, what is it that ultimately keeps us down? In the search for truth, I think this is, you know, to use the example of Nazi Germany, perhaps, you really had to come to an understanding that fascism ultimately was deadly. And this was hard. This was something that the Christians in Germany did not want to unilaterally affirm either. In fact, while there were some Christians that were on the side of Hitler, the majority of Christians was undecided, somewhere in the middle. In other words, they never asked this question of truth. They basically stayed out of it, and they assumed that things would take care of themselves. That never happens. So truth here has to be claimed and reclaimed in the struggle against what's wrong and what's false. So we're not giving up on truth, but we're saying this has to be a conversation. Your question, if I understood it right, was about the content. What truths are we affirming? Well, there are truths, I would say, of human dignity, that nobody deserves to live in subhuman conditions. Nobody deserves to be treated less justly than others, right? Nobody deserves to be looked down upon. And this is not just about material things. This is also about people's agency. This is about people's power. Nobody deserves to be used just for the purposes of somebody else. Those are some of the fundamental truths. I think if you had an interreligious dialogue on that, you could see how various religions are in agreement on that. This is something, by the way, that my wife and I put together in book form a couple of years ago. Title of the book was Unified, We Are a Force, How Faith and Labor Can Overcome America's Inequalities. And our argument there was basically, we're dealing in this book with the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, that there are resources in each of these religious traditions that are just mind-boggling for liberation and for moving us forward. One example we gave in the book was, how do you rethink some of the high holidays? What is Christmas all about? Well, if Christmas is about baby Jesus in the manger, that's one thing. But if Christmas is ultimately about God's liberation, starting in unexpected places with day laborers in construction and shepherds in the field, maybe you got something. In Judaism, if you think about, Passover, you could really go back to some fundamental truths where you find God on the side, choosing the side intentionally of the slaves, the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. And this is no small step. God's self ultimately taking sides in the burning bush, saying, I have seen the problems, I have heard the cry of my people, we're going to go and do something about it. Together with Moses and the gang, right? Miriam and everybody else. If you go to Islam, you could talk about celebration of Ramadan, which oftentimes is seen, this is the fasting month, right? Which is oftentimes seen as tied to the giving of alms. But it's more than that, it could really be a place where people put themselves in the place of people who have not enough to eat. By the way, here's another truth. 29.5% of all American families at this moment do not have enough food. That's a truth that's not just a social one, but if that's not a religious truth, that would have to be discussed in religious communities. I don't know what else is, except that it's, of course, not many communities yet who are talking about it.
In my work in labor organizing, we do not talk about our religious commitments, which is too often diverse. So yes, interreligious, interfaith dialogue might deepen collective stance against predatory and exploitative managers, owners. So this material initial concern binds us organically already.
I think that is the crucial point I was trying to make. There are some connections that we have. You could philosophically, very broadly say we're all connected as human beings, but the reality is we're ultimately connecting in the places of work. These are the places where we spend the bulk of our waking hours, right? These are the places in our society that are most likely to be most diverse. And this is where some of this work needs to be happening. I'm very happy to declare Vanderbilt Divinity School my home, where we are also doing this work. But ultimately, if we don't get it out of the schools and maybe even out of the religious communities into the workplaces, I don't think we're really moving forward effectively enough so that we can make a difference. But once we do, and I think that was part of the questions, once we do that, I think there's tremendous potential. The question, of course, is how do we do it? And especially here in the southeast of the United States, Christianity has been so dominant and still is that as a Christian person, it is oftentimes difficult to even talk about this. And for understandable reasons. This is something I think those of us who are Christians really have to sink in and have to digest. What would it really mean to talk about our religious traditions in non-dominant forms, not claiming that we know better than anybody else, but making contributions that nevertheless move us all forward together, that may have some advice as to how you build communal power, that may have some insights. But in order to do that, of course, you have to listen more than you talk. This is something that I cannot do tonight because this is a lecture where I am lecturing. But I think this is really crucial also as we build these interreligious relationships through our common connections. And here, of course, this is going back to the 99%, right? 99% of us have to work for a living. If we started to listen to each other, told each other the truth about who wins and who loses, and maybe then shared some of what our own religious traditions have to offer, things would be different. Anyways, that's what I'm hoping for, and that's certainly what I'm committed to in my own work. And I'm hoping this is what we're accomplishing to some degree in the Wendling Cook program and at Vanderbilt Divinity School.
What words might you offer Christians, especially in the West, who are fully prepared to suffer and unfortunately watch others suffer in their defense of Jesus as the one way, truth, and life? And Christianity, therefore, is the one truth. In other words, how might someone who works in religion towards liberation and therefore the fighting of the biggest problems of our age deal with religious people in the church, in the community, perhaps some who have not studied world religions, etc., who knowingly choose suffering rather than the inclusion of non-Christian belief systems in the fight against injustice? There are many texts in the Christian scriptures, for example, that almost invite followers of Jesus to put up walls against other religious beliefs.
It would be interesting to look at these texts because my hunch is that the walls that are to be put up here is not so much against other religions, but even if you go back to the Hebrew prophets in the Hebrew Bible, the walls are actually against oppression and injustice and the abuse of people. So if you think about those walls and the walls that people are oftentimes putting up, I think that's the big difference that we'd have to take into account. Now, your question is how do we actually do that? How do we help people understand ultimately what it might be worth suffering for and what isn't worth suffering for? My most recent book I've titled Jesus versus Caesar, and it has this tongue-in-cheek subtitle, For People Tired of Serving the Wrong God. I think this is a deeply theological question because it seems to me this Jesus, that requires you to do certain things that you were just describing, may ultimately not be the true God. This may be a false God. And, a lot of God talk, I think, that happens within Christianity shares this problem that we're ultimately worshiping the God of empire rather than the God of Jesus Christ, or the gods that could be discussed from other religious traditions. So we ultimately limit ourselves precisely by embracing these dominant images, even if it means that we're being hurt. This is an interesting parallel, by the way, to how white supremacy functions. If you think about how much white supremacy ultimately benefits, say, poor white people. Now, I know it benefits some, I'm not disputing that, but that perhaps poor white people are also being hurt by white supremacy, right? There's a recent work by one of our Vanderbilt colleagues, Jonathan Metzl, Dying of Whiteness, how white supremacy actually hurts white people themselves. This is what we're talking about, how a false dominant position ultimately hurts people. Now, it also helps some, keep that in mind too, right? This white supremacy, of course, doesn't hurt all white people. It helps the 1%. It helps certain people then to run the show and to call the shots. The same is true for religion. This sort of religious suffering that was described here ultimately helps some people perhaps make a lot of money, do the religious power thing, do a neo-colonial thing that we are also seeing. And so the way to fight it then, I think, is really to point out how not only is this religion and white supremacy included here idolatrous, um, but it ultimately doesn't help you. It's ultimately not working for the common good. It's destructive. And it only means that the few are becoming more powerful at the expense of the many. So my approach here in addressing this is not so much to blame people for having these wrong beliefs, but to invite them to see who really wins and who really loses, and to realize that the majority of us are not winning here. Now, maybe just one more thing here, because I think these positions oftentimes come from a very deep effort to do the right thing, to believe the right thing, to be a true follower of Jesus and all of that. And so I think that has to be respected. But for that reason, I think you need to have some strong theological arguments to show that this is actually not the true Jesus. It's actually not the true God. This is what I've done in many ways in my own religious career, pointing out these differences between Jesus, Caesar, empire, and so on.
Where is the largest opportunity for dialogue now? What are the economics of it?
You know, if dialogue is seen as a luxury, you'll always have some people dialoguing who think they're enjoying it, you know, or that have a special interest. The dialogue that I'm talking about is really happening at the place where there are pressures. You know, you could maybe dramatically say dialogue is happening in struggles of life and death. And so that's what we have to figure out. Some of the examples I gave you one was Dalit Hinduism in India, where what you find among Dalits is some very interesting and deep interreligious encounters that we might not even call them interreligious dialogues, but you have Christian Dalits and Hindu Dalits and Muslim Dalits joining forces in some of these cases. You know, if you look at the farmers now protesting in India, this is not a religious movement, but this is a prime place for interreligious engagement. Now, that has to be developed. I'm not saying it's already happening, but this is where I think dialogue is not only fun and interesting, but life-changing. It could actually change movements. It could change politics. It could change economics. Take that closer to home, and I would like to bring this back to issues of labor. You know, in my own field, what's very strange is that very few theologians are actually talking about labor at this point. Some are talking about economics, but when you talk about labor, you really have to talk about working people. And again, here, now we're talking about essential workers. We finally realized that there are some workers without whom we could not survive. That's a pretty big insight. Could also lead to the question, what kind of workers are not so essential? How essential are religionists? How essential are professors? How essential are pastors? They become essential, I think, when they move together alongside these essential workers and start building movements of solidarity. I mean, I mentioned Black Lives Matter. I mentioned Occupy Wall Street. I mentioned the Dakota Access Pipeline. Those are all examples of vibrant examples, I would say, of interreligious dialogue that are not just the hobbies of the people that can afford it, but that are absolute necessities for building strong movements and ultimately making a difference in the world.
We have one more question for tonight. Thank you for your lecture. I am wondering how your approach regarding the common good and interreligious cooperation in matters of justice differs from Pope Francis, particularly as seen in the recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti and the document on human fraternity signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar.
That's a wonderful question to conclude on. So thank you so much for putting it out there. I haven't read the whole encyclical Fratelli Tutti, but what I have read, I must say, I was very excited when I read it because I find there is a lot of overlap. And I somehow find that the Pope is saying a few things that I have said in other places. I'm not saying that the Pope copied what I was saying. I'm actually saying I think that the time is right when more and more of us um, understand that we have to build solidarity, that we have to bring people together in broad movements because we cannot. Nobody can solve this by themselves as individuals for sure, but we can also not solve our common situation simply via minority movements. This is not to say that the minority movements have not made great contributions. They have, and we need them. But the question is, how do we put these things back together again? And I think what I understood Pope Francis to say was that there is some, well, fratelli, I guess, is not just brotherhood, but it's also sisterhood and community ultimately that has to move not just through the world of ideas, but really through the world of building real and deep relationships. Now, in my view, though, and maybe this is a difference. I'm a theologian, but I'm also a bit suspicious about big, high-fluent theological ideas. If there's this broad idea of the brotherhood or the siblinghood of humanity, I appreciate it. I certainly support it, but I don't think these things are ultimately born in somebody's mind at the top. So if the idea is that because the Pope said something, we now do it, I don't have much faith that it will happen. But if this is an idea whose time has come, if this is an idea that we see bubbling up at the grassroots, and I believe it is, then we really have a new hope. And maybe this is the dynamic that the Pope is tying into as well. I think he is. I mean, in some ways, he understands this based on his own background. But that doesn't mean that ultimately the hope here comes from the top. Ultimately, I oftentimes say to my students, if there is any hope, it's not that my ideas somehow will be followed by somebody or that I can tell anybody what to do. But that I can pick up the sort of things that are happening all around us already, the solidarity movements that are happening all around us already, the interfaith dialogues that are happening around us already. And I can lend a hand, I can lend some clarity, I can strengthen things, I can help sort things out critically. 2 or 3 years ago, I was contacted by a colleague at the World Council of Churches, which is, of course, very ecumenical, strong Roman Catholic participation there also, about becoming part of a new working group on interreligious dialogue. And I said, I really am not that interested in simply talking about religion to other people who are also religionists or people of faith. I'm interested, however, if we do this work, now focusing on our common struggles. And common struggles here could be a broad thing. I'm not saying it's just one thing. As you can hear from what I'm saying, I'm definitely committed to labor issues, but I also believe that we have to struggle along the lines of racial oppression, sexual and gendered oppression, and so on, and other forms of exploitation, including ecological exploitation and extraction. But my point was, if we work along these lines together, we'll have a new ecumenical dialogue. And this is what the work group has been doing. We've had 2 meetings. One was in Cambodia, 2018. One was in Kenya in 2019. Another one would have been in 2020, but was not possible due to COVID. We'll keep working along these lines, but this is now a group that's talking about interreligious dialogue and liberation. Some of the publications have already appeared. Some of what I've said here tonight, I have said in these working groups also. And it's really amazing to me to get the responses. Remember an Indian feminist colleague from Bangalore in India, being a very close ally, working with a Muslim woman from Lebanon, working with people in various countries around the world, and realizing that there's so much that we still have to learn from each other. That's what excites me about my work. That's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me writing, for sure. And I hope those of us who were with us tonight will keep working on these things, check in with us, work alongside. And I think this is the way forward. So thank you.
Joerg, you have two thank yous. The first one from the questioner from 2 questions ago. Thank you for your substantive answer to my question. It perfectly answered what I needed for a long time. And
thank you. I appreciate that.
And on behalf of the Divinity School, I want to thank you, Joerg, for the time you've given us tonight. It has been rich, and we look forward to seeing what comes next from you. Thanks all for joining us tonight, and take good care.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks everybody.
There was another one in the chat, Joerg, that came in just as we were disconnected, I think, from everyone. This has been a great lecture. Thanks so much.
I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks, Emily. I look forward to continuing some of these conversations. I think there's a lot there. I really appreciated these questions. Would have been easier to have the person and to look somebody in the face and to see if I'm getting at it and maybe to have a follow-up. But hopefully we've done them some justice, and I think the responses were great. So thanks for the invite. I appreciate being part of this, and I look forward to all that we're doing.